In this lesson we're going to discuss how a sailboat works, how the sails are powered up and how the sailboat sails in the wind. Most landlubbers have this perception that sailors catch the wind, but most of the time we actually fly the wind. So going back to the sailing circle, got the wind from the top blowing down, the no-go zone directly into the wind. And then we've got this green area over there and the red area at the bottom. The red area is essentially between a training run on the one side and training run on the other side. And if you're sailing in that small segment of the pie, as it were, you're catching the wind. So in the red area, the red boat is catching the wind. Whereas if you're sailing anywhere in the green area, which is a far larger area than the red area, you are flying the wind. The wind is actually pulling you forward as opposed to pushing you downwind as it is in the red area. The principles of sailing a boat and the principles of flying an aeroplane are very, very similar. And we'll be using, to explain these concepts, I'm going to draw a couple of diagrams on the board and then we'll discuss them as we're going along. Firstly, if I draw an old-fashioned boat, often referred to as a pirate boat with the square sails, these boats were only able to sail essentially downwind. And similarly, if I draw an old-fashioned parachute, a World War I, World War II parachute, we know that these guys could float down on the wind, but they didn't have much steering. Most of us aren't old enough to remember them, but we've all seen the movies, and they used to land in treetops and on roofs and things like that. So they used to float down on the wind. So the commonality between these two types is that they had very limited steering. The old-fashioned boats could sail downwind but not upwind, and the old-fashioned parachutes used to float down on the wind. Now if we look at the more modern type of vessels, our boats with triangular sails, we know from the last lesson, the sailing circle, that we can sail right up to the no-go zone. So roughly about 45 degrees to the wind. And the wing parachutes, sorry, I'm no artist, but hopefully you'll get the picture. We know that these guys can land on a bullseye in a sports field. So here we can certainly sail upwind, and these guys can certainly steer, as opposed to their predecessors, the old-fashioned parachutes that just used to float down on the wind. So what is the magic of all of this? The real magic is to do with this shape. That shape over there. And as we progress through this lesson, we will discuss how this shape really helps us. To explain this concept of flying the wind rather than catching the wind, I'm going to use something that we're all a little bit more familiar with than sailing a sailboat, and that is flying an aeroplane. So firstly, we know that an aeroplane has got two wings, one on either side, and they are identical because they're both in air, whereas a sailboat, which also has two wings, the sail up at the top and the keel and rudder below the waterline, and they are differently shaped in size because water is a lot more denser than air. So we don't need as big a wing, as it were, in the water as we do above. Now, an aeroplane, we know that when it taxis down the runway, it gains speed, goes faster and faster and faster, and eventually, magically, this hugely heavy piece of equipment lifts off up into the sky. And to explain how this works in really, really simple terms, I'm going to draw a diagram of a plane. Just give me a sec to do that. So there's my plane wing, shaped something like that. Fuselage off over this side, there's the tail, rest of the fuselage, and the other wing is out on the other side. Now we have some wind that flows directly below the wing as this plane taxis down the runway. And we have other wind that is going to flow directly above the wing, following the curve of the wing. And most of the wind that is in this gap between the blue and orange lines is forced up over the wing. Now there was a very clever physicist by the name of Benulli, and he came up with a principle which is commonly known as Bernoulli's principle, that whatever air enters the wing plan there has got to exit the wing plan there at the same time. And the air that is flowing over the top of the wing has got further to travel than the air that is flowing directly underneath the wing. So it stands to reason that if it's got to enter and exit at the same time, the orange air must be traveling faster, and the blue air is traveling slower. And what that does is it creates a pressure difference. And we have a high pressure below the wing and a low pressure above the wing. And as most of us know, when we have high and low pressures in the same medium, whatever the medium is wants to move from the high pressure to the low pressure area. And this is exactly what happens here, and we end up with what we call lift, which is perpendicular to the curve of the wing in an upward direction, from the high pressure to the low pressure. And as a result, as the plane taxis down the runway and gains speed, and the pressure difference increases, eventually the plane takes off and becomes airborne due to the lift on its wings. Now, how does this apply to a sailboat? Well, there's my sailboat, and there is my mainsail. Notice I've drawn it with that magical curve rather than just a straight line. Our wind is from the top, in that direction. And again, we're going to have some air which travels on the inside of the sail, and some air which travels on the outside of the sail. And according to Benulli's principle, whatever air enters the sail plan there has got to exit the sail plan there at the same time. Because the sail has thickness, the orange air would need to travel faster, and the blue air therefore is traveling slower. This creates a pressure difference, and we have a high pressure on the inside of the sail and a low pressure on the outside of the sail. And as a result, we have lift perpendicular to the curve. Now I'm sure some of you are looking at this and thinking, well, that's all great, but we don't really want the sailboat to be going in that direction. We want it to be going forward. And remember that unlike an aeroplane, where both wings are identical because they're in the same medium, being air, on a sailboat, our one wing is the sail, which is sticking up, and the other wing is the keel, which is below the waterline. And the keel sits usually just after the mast, just backwards of the mast, over there. And it is also a wing, and the lift on the keel will be in that direction, and the resultant force will take us forward. So as you can see from these two diagrams, we're not really catching wind. We are flying the wind, much as an aeroplane flies the wind. And if we take this one step further and add a second sail, straw boat again, so it's uncluttered for you guys. There's my mainsail. There's my foresail, often called a jib or a genoa. And we know that we have, on the mainsail, we have lift in that direction. And certainly on the foresail, there is a little bit of lift in that direction. But that's not the real magic. What is really happening over here with the foresail is we're creating a venturi effect. For those of you who are not familiar with the venturi effect, if you can imagine that this pin is a hose pipe and we have water flowing out of the hose pipe, if I were to put my thumb across the top of the hose pipe, it would accelerate the water that is now shooting out of it, and that is a venturi effect. So what we're doing here is we're taking the air between the front edge of our foresail and the front edge of our mainsail, all of that air, and we're squeezing it through this little gap over here. And effectively, we're accelerating the air across the back of the mainsail. And that is the air that was traveling faster in this diagram over here. So the foresail is enhancing the airflow across the back of the mainsail and therefore increasing a greater pressure difference on either side of our sail. And it is exponentially increasing the lift on the mainsail, and that's the real magic. It's not the lift on the foresail itself. I hope you've got some value out of this video. If you have, please remember to subscribe. And if you have any questions, drop them in the comments below.